Okay, I want to take this video to go over some other artistic and literary trends that have to do with the theme of death in the late Middle Ages. I'm going to try not to cough my way through this. I've got a pretty bad cold, so hopefully I may have to periodically take some drinks of water or something like that. So just appreciate your patience if you're watching this. One literary tradition, which also has a kind of artistic outgrowth to it, is a genre of literature called memento mori. To call it a genre of literature may not be the most apropos thing, I suppose, but it's a literary trope that shows up starting in about the 14th century. This almost certainly is in association with the huge mortality rates during the Black Death and the subsequent outbreaks of plague thereafter. And there are precedents certainly for this in earlier periods. The memento mori, the term itself in Latin means something like, remember that you're going to die. Literally, it's like remembrance to die is the literal translation, but the connotation is remember that you're going to die. This is something that would be written on a grave monument, or possibly engraved on a religious building somewhere, potentially in a manuscript that dealt with the theme of death. There's a fair amount of like poetry and other texts that take up this theme. And we can see this pretty clearly here in a document that's from the year 1399. This actually is from a song. We do have remnants and manuscripts of medieval music, and this is from one of these. I gave the Latin on the left because I wanted you to see the alliteration here and the kind of use of poetic devices. Vita brevis breviter in brevi finietur. Life is short, vita brevis, and it will end shortly in short, literally translated, and it shortly will end. But we don't get enough shorts in the translation here. Like the whole connotation is life is really short, right? And you're going to die very soon, okay? So, mors venit velociter, quae neminem veretur. Death comes quickly and respects no one. Death destroys everything and takes pity on no one. To death we are hastening. Let us refrain from sinning. If you do not turn back and become like a child and change your life for the better, you will not be able to enter, blessed, the kingdom of God. To death we are hastening. Let us refrain from sinning. And so we see this refrain here, right? Ad mortem festinamus peccare desistamus. We are hastening to death. Let us cease to sin. That really is the message of this. It's like you're going to die, so make sure that you're ready for that your soul is in a state that you are prepared for death, right? Life expectancy in the Middle Ages, particularly in the late Middle Ages, with these repeated outbreaks of plague, with constant war, it was not high. And infant mortality was always, through the whole of the pre-modern period, incredibly high, right? I mean, this is something that we are simply not accustomed to because of modern medicine. It has made it so very few, infants and children die in childbirth or thereafter, but it used to be a very common occurrence that, and you can look back in records, perhaps I've done this kind of with my own family history a little bit, to see that, in ages before the development of, modern drugs like antibiotics, that it was common, say a family would have 6 or 7 children, for 1, 2, 3 of them to die before they reach the age of 5, or maybe even the age of 2, right? And so death was always around. It was and it was a constant reminder to people, and this contributed certainly to the religious mentality, and vice versa. The religious mentality contributed to their attitudes about death. One of the artistic tropes that shows up a lot in the late Middle Ages, and there are, again, some antecedents to this in earlier periods, is this theme of the triumph of death. And it's from this that we start to get the classic depictions of death as the Grim Reaper, as a skeletal figure with a robe. Of course, the pale horse has been around since the Book of Revelation, and that's been a constant association. But the Grim Reaper figure is a kind of late medieval development. And so here in a 15th century manuscript, which is one of the most richly decorated texts of the whole of the Middle Ages, the Très Richeur, that was commissioned by a French nobleman, the Duc de Berry, we see here a procession of skeletons, right? Here we have soldiers, it seems, fighting a war, or, they're marching off to war or something like that, and this procession of skeletons holding things like a sickle, right? Here's the Grim Reaper imagery. Death itself is actually shown on the pale horse as a kind of nobleman, dressed in rich robes with a feather in his cap, and holding a sword, right? Directing this army of skeletons. But the skeletal imagery is already present here. And there were some artistic renderings before this one, certainly, where those showed up too. And this culminates in images like these. So the one on the right is from the mid-15th century, actually predates the Très Richeur. This is called the Palermo fresco, so it's from southern Italy, or actually from Sicily. And you can see here the pale horse, which now has a kind of skeletal cast to it, and death now portrayed as a skeleton riding on this. And the implication, if we can kind of blow this up a little bit here, is that it doesn't matter who you are, right? Death is coming for you. You can be a pope or a bishop. You can be a noblewoman in the case here, or even a king, right? I think there's the robes over here are somewhat royal, okay? You can be incredibly talented as a musician, right? You can be in the prime of your life. You can be a religious figure like a hermit. This is a depiction of a Franciscan friar down here in the gray robe. It doesn't matter. Death will come for you. Death is inevitable. Death will triumph. Probably the most recognizable triumph of death scene is the one painted in the second half of the 16th century. It's dated 1562 by Peter Bruegel the Elder. I'm not able to blow this image up for whatever reason. I don't think there are enough pixels to it. So I've actually got a version of the image that I've just pulled up from Wikipedia here, because I wanted to show you some of the details of this, right? Here we have the fully realized version of death, okay? The skeletal figure with the sickle. He's not dressed in a big hooded cloak or anything like we see with later versions of the Grim Reaper, or some versions of the Grim Reaper. The pale horse looks a bit reddish here, right? But he is going through and cutting people down, and all these people are fleeing from death, right? But in addition to that, we've got an army of skeletons dressed in these robes, holding shields, like coming for people. And you've got, again, the message is, no matter who you are, here we have people dressed in obviously noble robes. At the lower left of the painting, we have a king who, is being kind of held by a skeleton. And there's another skeleton over here who seems to be taking from the king's treasury. Here we have barrels full of gold and silver coins, and the king can do absolutely nothing about this, right? We have wars going on where the skeletons, on pale horses, right, are running people down. And then here we have two skeletons ringing a bell. There is an army of skeletons encamped in a tent here, right? And we've even got instruments of torture. Here's a person kind of garroted on a tree, right? Here's a person who's been impaled. And this actually is a wheel that was a torture device in the Middle Ages. And here's a person hanged on a gallows. Okay, so, this kind of shows, like, criminals are going to get it, like the ones who were subject to the torture and things like hanging. But, juxtaposed to that, we have a king down here who's also, death is going to conquer him as well. So to help prepare people for the inevitability of death, the triumph of death, right, the remembrance that they're going to die, there was another literary trope, or rather, this almost is a genre of literature in the late Middle Ages, starting in about the 14th century, which is called the Ars Moriendi. The art of dying is what that means. And there are various authors write guidebooks for how to die well. The idea is, you will be tempted with all sorts of things all the way up to the moment of your death, and you need to hold off and die well in this, right? And so there are instructions on how to do that, and these are accompanied by illustrations. This is from a woodcut. This is a printed book, but one of the things that appear on printed books in this period, and actually for a couple of centuries after, are these wood block matrices that they carve intricate images into, and then these are printed on the page next to the text. What's going on in this one, and this is a pretty typical depiction of the Ars Moriendi tradition. We have a man on his deathbed, obviously. And he is sort of, there are two groups of voices appealing to him. Down here, we have obvious devils who are trying to tempt him, even at the moment of death, with the sorts of things that will land his soul in hell, right? Which will make him unworthy of going to heaven. And so this devil, for instance, is saying, Coronam meruisti, you deserve a crown, right? I mean, he's appealing to him with the sin of pride or potentially of greed. Down here we have the words exaltate ipsum, glory itself, not glory for the sake of like doing good, but glory itself. He's being tempted with that, again, out of envy or greed or something like that, right? You persevere impatiently. You should persevere impatiently is what this says, right? God, you deserve things from God. Take it because you deserve it, not because it's the grace of God, is really kind of the gist of these messages. But on the other hand, these holy figures over here, and we can identify them as, saints because they've got these these halos. This seems to be a depiction of the Virgin Mary. This perhaps is Jesus. This perhaps as God the Father. Sometimes they're depicted as separate entities or separate beings, though I'm not absolutely sure that's what's going on here. Okay. They simply say, basically give glory to God. Tu es firmus in fide. You are firm in the faith. Right? So they're encouraging the dying person to die well, whereas these devils are trying to make the person sin at the moment of death and thus go down to hell. This other one is a painting of Hieronymus Bosch, and we've already looked at the Garden of Earthly Delights in an earlier video. But this is called Death and the Miser. I have this pulled up in some detail here in my photos. So we've got a few things going on here. This is death, now a cloaked figure, a skeletal figure with some kind, not a sickle this time, but an arrow. It looks like that's pointing at the man, right? So his time has come. Here we have the miser and his, sumptuous bed. And you can tell it's called Death and the Miser because down here he seems to have hoarded treasures in a chest. And so he seems to be sort of keeping some of these things around. But the question is, what's going to happen to those treasures? He obviously can't take them with him. And at the moment of his death, here is an angel, appealing to him to look up at the crucifix, to look at Jesus. Whereas there's a devil here with a big sack of coins, and the man seems torn. He is staring straight ahead at death. His hand is reached out for this. His hand seems to be going up in a gesture, and it's uncertain exactly which direction he's going to go at the moment of his death. Down here we have an old man. I don't know if this is, perhaps him depicted earlier than his deathbed, or if it's somebody else, but he's got a set of keys. He's got a rosary. At the same time, he also has coins, right? He's torn between his wealth and his religious devotion. And here we have some kind of demon grabbing the sack of coins to let you know that these things are impermanent, that they will go away. You can't take them with you. Okay, and then we have this rather famous image that shows up on things like bookmarks, of a demon down here, a kind of winged demon sort of overseeing the whole situation. It's a pretty common literary or artistic trope. So Ars Moriendi, the art of dying well, the art of dying well, right? Another literary trope. A couple more. Death is often depicted dancing. This is called the famous Danse Macabre. the Dance of Death. And then this shows up all over the place in the late Middle Ages and into the early modern period, as a literary, or as a sometimes a literary depiction, but often an artistic depiction. This is one of the largest such programs. This is in a church in Tallinn, Estonia. It's the work of an artist from the late 15th century named Bernd Notke. And what you see here is that, these various skeletal figures which represent death, right, here in more of the Grim Reaper fashion, they are the ones dancing, right? They're trying to draw these other people into the dance, but they seem to be a great deal more excited about this dance than the living ones who were headed for death. And so that may be an indication of, like, death will be joyful to come when death gets you, and, you got to be prepared for this, even if you're not ready, right? And so here we have, this is a bishop figure, this is like a king or an emperor, a queen or a noblewoman, a cardinal, a nobleman, and the scene actually goes on, and, depictions like this appear in other places as well. Okay, so death as a dance. Now, this may have come, and this is in the Aberth reading, from certain physiological reactions the body had to plague, that as it was dying, it would go into these involuntary twitches, and people started imagining death as a dance for some reason. That's one possible explanation for why death is depicted dancing. But whatever it is, this catches on and, becomes a very common trope. Maybe the most famous are the woodcuts done in the early 16th century, 1520s is when these date to, by Hans Holbein the Younger, one of the famous artists of that period, who also painted portraits of Martin Luther and did a lot of other things. But these woodcuts, the Dance of Death, right, show, that death, again, is coming for everyone here. Death is finding a peddler as he's, he's got a pack on his back, and he's, I guess, going from one town to another to sell his wares, and death is like, nope, you're not going anywhere. You're coming with me. This is an abbess, the head of a convent of nuns, who is being taken out, and the nun behind her is crying out, no, you can't take her, but death says, I will take her, and she's coming to dance with me, right? Here we have, various skeletons doing their best Mardi Gras routine, I suppose. They're, playing the drums and playing various instruments. This seems to be a kind of horn or trombone almost thing. And then over here we have a farmer. Death is stopping his oxen and ready to take him at this point, even though he's in the middle of plowing his field. So again, the inevitability of death, death is going to make you dance even if you're not ready to dance, is the idea here. And then a final one that's brought up in Aberth that I think is interesting is the notion that you can play games with death, right? You can try to stave death off by challenging him to a chess match or something like that, right? That you are constantly trying to cheat death, but ultimately death will win out. A couple of images here. This one from the 15th century. This is in the city of Norwich in England, the Church of St. Andrew there. And here we have a bishop, it seems, playing with death, and death, I think, has checkmated him. And then over here, this is actually an image from Sweden. It's a fresco from, I think, the early 16th century. I can't remember the exact date of this one, where we have a nobleman, again, playing with death, playing chess with death. This shows up even in modern depictions. One film that I highly recommend watching, especially after taking this course, is Ingmar Bergman's classic 1957 film, Seventh Seal, which features a chess match between the main character, who's played by Max von Sydow. The character's name is Antonius Bloch, right? And he is playing a chess match against death. Really trying to buy some time to do some good in the world before he dies is really the answer, even though he is having a personal faith crisis and these other things, right? So this is a potent image that has some staying power to it. Okay, well, that's, I think, all that I wanted to cover in this, and hopefully, you've gotten a view of the ideas about death that were happening in the High and Late Middle Ages, that this was something on people's minds. It was a topic of conversation, a topic of, for creativity and literature and art. and that there's a background to this, which is that people were dying frequently, that death was a constant in their lives. Again, questions, please feel free to ask them on the discussion board and other things like that.